purpose of the Institute for Mathematical Behavioral Sciences is to do exactly what the title states. It is an attempt to try to find ways to harness the muscle power of mathematics to be able to understand some of the issues which arise in the behavioral and social sciences. The problems in the behavioral and social sciences, in my opinion, I come from the physical sciences. The problems in the social and behavioral sciences are difficult. And it really is a problem of dimension, you know, the curse of dimensionality. And that, to a large extent, is the problem of the social and behavioral sciences that we have to try to come to grips with. And in doing so, what we do is bring together conferences, interdisciplinary conferences of this type right here, where the objective is to get people from different disciplines to discuss, talk about things, find out what the issues are. We have mathematicians, we have various other disciplines represented here, and with the hope of making large advances in these areas. And so this conference is the 5th that we've had this year of this type. And this one right here, most of the work of putting it together was done by Kimberly and Natalia. And so I would like to start with Kimberly. Why don't you be who will be the chair for this afternoon's session?
Sure.
Kimberly?
It's a great pleasure. I introduce our first speaker of the conference. It's Paul Kay from UC Berkeley. Paul is a linguist and also an anthropologist, and is well known for his work on the cross-cultural study of color categorization and cognition. He's done some work in color perception as well, and a number of different types of projects on cross-cultural linguistics. Paul is currently retired. Is that right, Paul? After teaching at Berkeley for something like
possibly permanently
30 years, right? But he's as active as ever, collaborating with a number of people and publishing in top-tier journals on the topics that he's going to discuss today, namely the relativity versus universals, an obsolete dichotomy. His talk is with Terry REGIER, and it's a great pleasure to introduce you, Paul.
It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. I want to emphasize this talk is by Kay and REGIER, and I'm going to give the first half, and Terry's going to give the second half. But this is work we've done together, all of it. Okay, so you see the title, Relativity versus Universals, an Obsolete Dichotomy. The major point is going to be that the opposition of so-called relativism and so-called universalism, under those or other words, impedes our understanding of the complex ways in which language both influences perception and is influenced by perception. The plan of the talk, the total talk, is going to be that first I'm going to talk about the influence of language on color perception and discrimination. And the moral is going to be highly hedged relativism. And then Terry is going to give the second half of the talk on color naming similarities and differences across languages. And the moral of that is going to be a kind of a hedged universalism. And excuse me, I'm going to get a laser pointer. Okay, previous work that goes back to 1984 has demonstrated categorical perception for color. By categorical perception, I mean the phenomenon according to which people make finer discriminations at the borders between categories than they do in the interior of categories. Okay, for anyone who's not familiar with that term. And I'm going to use this abbreviation CP all the time. But it's important. I know this is very old hat to some of you, but I think it may be new to others of you, depending on your background. I just repeat that the issue is of categorical perception is that refers to the propensity to make finer discriminations at the borderlines between categories than at the interior of categories. Okay, categorical perception occurs at the boundaries of linguistically encoded basic color terms. That's also something that's been in the background, established by previous work. And that when the basic color term boundaries differ between languages, color CP occurs at the linguistic boundaries. So in other words, it is determined by language differences. And that's all prior stuff. This part of the talk is about recent work showing that color CP is lateralized to the right visual field and therefore to the left cerebral hemisphere. And this is some background that may be way too familiar to many of you, but I know this is a mixed group. The visual fields project to the brain contralaterally, which is a fancy multisyllabic way of saying that the left visual field projects to the right hemisphere, and the right visual field projects to the left hemisphere. And okay, that's one. And the other is that the left hemisphere is dominant for language. And here's a picture of famous Wernicke's and Broca's area from, I guess, from the 19th century or early 20th century. Okay, the first experiment that I'm going to talk about, oh my goodness. Well, these are not such true colors here. These are supposed to be blue, and these green, and this is supposed I thought we had the color thing figured out, but I should have checked this slide because this is the key color difference. This is the boundary between blue and green. So this is a very bluish green, and this is a very greenish blue. And then this is a greener green than this one, and this is a bluer blue than that one. Okay. The experimental setup was as follows. First, the subjects saw only this fixation cross. They were told to fixate on the cross. Then they got a brief presentation of an array of colors, colored squares, all of which were the same, which we will call the distractors, except for one, which we'll call the target. And the task of the experimental subject was, with a finger press, to indicate which side the oddball was on. Now, the issue was which side it's on and whether it's the same or a different category. So let's say these are B and this one is C. Then we would have left visual field and we would have a cross-category match. If it had been over here and it had been A over here, then we would have had right visual field and a same category match, okay? So the two variables are within or across category, same or opposite visual field. Now, the prediction from the Whorfian prediction, if you like, almost all of you probably have heard of Benjamin Lee Whorf, sort of a philosophical, anthropological linguist type of the mid-20th century, who wrote some very persuasive, if not very scientifically well-grounded arguments that language has a great influence on perception and cognition generally. The Whorfian prediction is going to be that if language is playing a role, language is going on in the left cerebral hemisphere, it should differentially help with perception in the right visual field. So the right visual field for cross-category perception. And sure enough, that's what we find. We find in the right visual field that the between or cross-category, this is reaction times, that was the dependent variable, is much faster than within categories, nothing going on in the left visual field. Now, the first inference you get from this is, wow, these linguistic categories are really affecting the perception. Then we gave subjects a verbal interference task where they had to remember a multi-digit number and rehearse it while it was going on. And under those conditions, we see that we don't get the same effect as this. We actually get a reversal here in the right visual field. Now, why it's a reversal rather than no effect, that'll be for the quiz next week. By the way, stop me. And we're a small enough group. Feel free to stop me and object or ask questions whenever. The second experiment was pretty much just a replication of the first. In the no interference condition, we got this same categorical perception effect with between categories much faster than within in the right visual field, nothing in the left visual field. The same reversal result with the verbal interference in the right visual field, nothing in the left visual field. But just for an additional control, we had a nonverbal interference task. And if you note that with the nonverbal interference, you get exactly the same pattern as with no interference. That is, you get the categorical perception effect in the right visual field and nothing in the left visual field. Okay, so the moral of that story is that elimination of the lateralized Whorf effect with verbal interference, and only verbal interference, argues that linguistic categories are activated online in this task, against the learning of linguistic categories having warped the perceptual space itself. Some writers on the Whorf hypothesis have suggested that language actually warps the perceptual space. And this seems to show pretty clearly that it's not that the perceptual space is warped, but that either in the process of perception or in immediate very fast post-perceptual processing, that things get filtered through the linguistic categories in some way. Whether the effect is strictly speaking perceptual or involves immediate post-perceptual processing can't be answered from these data. Okay, well, that's just one study. There was a later couple of studies that were performed at the University of Surrey in England that further replicate this. The first was a reanalysis of an earlier study, and I'm not going to take the time to tell you what the purpose of that study was, because it's really irrelevant to the point here. But the subjects were given either a set of three colors that all belong to different categories, but were equally spaced in the CIE space, the U prime, V prime version, or there were three different colors of the same named category, green. And there was a reason for doing that. Don't tell you what it was, but anyway, the task was to use two of these, either from this set or from this set, as distractors, and after central fixation, find the oddball as quickly as possible. And so, since it was analyzable by visual field, the original researchers didn't analyze it by visual field, but we did. and we found that, sure enough, although we got categorical perception effects in both visual fields, and let's see, the target is indicated by okay. The difference between these two figures is irrelevant to our purposes. You can think of them as one. And you have categorical perception effects in both visual fields, but it's greater in the right visual field. Same thing here. Greater difference here than here. I'm going to argue later that the reason that you get categorical perception in the left visual field at all in this experiment is probably because the reaction times were really long and there was plenty of time for transcallosal transfer. And in fact, in this experiment, there may have been actual scanning, for all we know. Another experiment, this one is very similar to the ones we did at Berkeley. Slight difference in setup, that rather than having a neutral background with distractors of one color and target of another color, what you had was the distractor color was the background, and you just had the target show up in one of these spots. In other words, the little white things here are places where the target might have shown up but didn't on this trial. Okay, using the same stimuli as before. And again, this is irrelevant. We again get categorical perception here. Actually, even though these error bars overlap here, these are 95% interval, 95% confidence interval error bars, and this difference is significant. The difference here is not significant, and the difference here is significant. So again, every time you do get it in the left visual field, categorical perception, you get a stronger effect in the right visual field. So that looks like it's pretty persuasive so far. Well, you might say, what about split brain patients? They should also show this effect. You know what split brain patients are? They're people whose corpus callosum has been severed because of epilepsy. And so their brain hemispheres don't talk to each other. Here's one patient. This patient had very heavy left hemisphere lesions, so he's really slow in the right visual field, but significantly faster on the between categories. Nothing in the left visual field, no difference. Another patient, very much the same pattern. We have faster between them within and the right visual field, nothing in the left visual field. Is the restriction of a categorical perception to the right visual field restricted to color? Well, no. Here are a couple of dogs and a couple of cats. And here's a setup like the one that we had with colors, only here's the oddball. It happens to be a cat in the right visual field right here. And here are the results. With no interference, we get the categorical perception effect in the right visual field only. With nonverbal interference, we get the categorical perception effect in the right visual field, nothing significant in the left visual field. With verbal interference, the categorical perception effect goes away, but we don't get the same reversal that we did before. I don't know why that is.
How come with verbal interference, the amount of time is the same? They don't become slower.
With verbal interference, I'm sorry?
The average time is about 800, if I can read correctly, and it's the same without interference. They don't become slower when they have to memorize large numbers.
I'm sorry, I don't.
He's asking about, there's no response time difference when there's a dual task?
What you see is what we got.
I'm not questioning it, I'm just asking, maybe it's interesting.
Yeah. Well, it's true that it's all. I think the probably the task, excuse me, is significantly more difficult, I suspect, than the color thing, and the response times are almost twice as long. And maybe that's why. Maybe that has something to do with the fact that the dual task didn't. But I really don't know. Okay, what about other languages? One of the stimulus for this doing this at all was that Willard Kempton and I had done a study in 1984. Similarity with similarity judgments rather than response times, and we found that we got categorical perception effects different in English from those in a language that had no blue-green lexical distinction. And Terry suggested, well, why don't we do that? Why don't we try doing that with visual fields? So this had come originally from work working on different languages, and it should work in different languages, and so far as we know it does. Now there's one published study, this study by Debbie Roberson, I mean just barely published in the sense that it's published online, but I think it's actually not in the paper yet. This was done in Korean. There are there are two words in Korean that more or less correspond to whose boundary is somewhere near the boundary between yellow and green in English, but not in the same place. And the slow responders showed categorical perception in both visual fields. These are both significant, but the fast responders only in the right visual field. This is for Korean. This is Korean speakers on the Korean boundary. English speakers didn't show. Then English speakers tested on the same boundary showed nothing. So that was sort of nice. Now there's a study that's only been only an abstract has come out so far by Drivenico, Davis, Franklin, and Taylor on Greek, which has two basic blue terms like Russian does and a few languages. And they found lateralized categorical perception too. But that's not been published yet. Okay, the visual field to brain hemisphere inference has been confirmed in an ERP study using the same stimuli as in the Berkeley 1 and 2 experiments. I think this is a very clever experimental setup. Well, I can say that because I had nothing to do with it. This is a mismatch negativity paradigm experiment. For those of you to whom this is new, mismatch negativity is a change in brain activity that occurs when, after repetition of the same stimulus has made it a familiar stimulus, a deviant stimulus is shown. And then there's a characteristic brain reaction as measured by EEG. So the way Aubrey Gilbert set this up was she had this blue color that's close to the boundary, and most of the 80% of the trials in either visual field, you get the standard blue color. But occasionally, you get the green color, or you get the other blue color. This is supposed to be the other blue color. So what you get is standard, 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 deviant, and then the deviant may either be the same or different category, and it may be in the left or right visual field. Okay? So it's basically the same thing that we were doing before, but translated into EEG. In a paradigm similar to ones used in previous visual mismatch negativity studies, event-related potentials were recorded in response to standard and deviant color stimuli presented lateral to a centralized task. Deviant stimuli, okay, this is all stuff that I just said. 2 deviance-related negativities were observed, an early 150 to 300 millisecond left hemisphere lateralized component at occipital and extrastriate sites, and a late 400 to 700 bilateral frontal component that was larger in the left hemisphere. Now, this is the kicker. These DRNs were evoked only when the cross-category deviant was presented in the right visual field. So, just as an example, the red line here is the cross-category deviant in the right visual field. There are, if you could see them, also a black line, a blue line, and a yellow line. And the only one that's significantly different is this red line right here that the arrow is pointed at. Similarly here, these were the early effects. This was the late effect. So we seem to have confirmation from that study of this. Recently in Lehigh Tan's lab in Hong Kong, we've had an fMRI study that where we had 3 colors that are easy to name in Mandarin Chinese and 3 colors that are hard to name in Mandarin Chinese, in the sense that if you give people subjects the color and you ask them for the name, it takes them for a long time to come up with something, or they can't come up with anything, and then they disagree with each other, and so on, whereas these people immediately find them easy to name. On just a pretest to see if they're as easy to recognize, they are basically as easy to recognize one as the other. This represents a control where instead of showing 2 colors and asking if they were same or different, you have an arrow pointing in one direction or the other. So that's what this arrow thing means. That's just preliminary. The interesting thing is, okay, in the test phase, the person is in the fMRI, in the MRI chamber, and the 2 colors are flashed on a screen in front of them, and they simply have to say if they're same or different. Well, they don't. They have to indicate with their fingers if they're the same or different. And the issue is whether there's a difference for the easy-to-name colors or for the hard-to-name colors, and where that difference shows up. These pictures here, B, represent the difference between the hard-to-name colors and the easy-to-name colors looked at from the top down. And you can see there's this spot over here on the left, which indicates where the easy-to-name colors lit up the brain and the hard-to-name colors didn't. That corresponds on this side, this is the left side of the brain, to this superior temporal and inferior parietal regions right there. And then in a localizer experiment, those same regions were found to be involved in matching color names to color stimuli, just showing a color and asking for the name, versus showing a Chinese character and asking them to name it. Okay, now I promised you earlier on.
So could I ask a question about that previous slide?
Yeah, sure.
So in the results prior to this fMRI study, you were suggesting that the lateralized, that it's contralateral, inputs from the visual field to the activation in the brain. Was there a visual field input?
No.
I mean,
No, we had no control. No. This was central focus.
Okay.
So there's huge overlap in visual fields, and the stimuli were in both visual fields.
So but you're still making the assertion that it's showing up in the left visual field, the left hemisphere.
Yeah. I'm still saying the inference that it looks like the language areas of the brain are involved in the task of just whether these stimuli were the same or different.
Okay, and then on the other task that you were describing, I now have a question about the fixation of the stimulus. So was eye tracking or used, or how did you? I know that there was a fixation cross in a lot of the studies, but how was that handled in terms of isolating, scanning, saccades, things like that?
Well, the answer is a little bit complicated to that. In the Berkeley studies, we didn't do eye tracking, but the window was small enough that it probably didn't occur. In the Surrey study, in the second Surrey study, the experimental one, they did do eye tracking, and in fact, what the response was the time between the onset of the stimulus and the first saccade to focus the target. So it wasn't a manual response at all. So sometimes there was eye tracking and sometimes there wasn't. Okay, I promised you before that that there would be an argument that the left visual field categorical perception was probably illusory. Here are the colostomy patients. Actually, the response times are irrelevant because their hemispheres don't talk to each other. And did you get any left visual field CP? No, you didn't. In the Berkeley experiments with relatively fast reaction times, you didn't get it. In the Surrey experiment number 2, a little longer, and actually what you did was at one color boundary, they tested 2 color boundaries, green, blue, and blue, purple. At one color boundary, there was no left visual field CP. At the other, there was. But that was the case that I pointed out to you, that even though the 95% confidence intervals overlap, there was still a significant difference. In the Robeson, that's the Korean study, the fastest subjects, which still were 700, and that was a task that was, as far as I can tell, very similar to one in our Berkeley experiments, and I have no idea why these Korean subjects were so much slower. I mean, I guess you had to be there or something. But these are the fast subjects, and they had no LVF-CP, but the really long response times are when you do get LVFCP. So it seems like probably cross-callosal transfer and possibly scanning in one case may account for that. Here are some aphasics. 15 aphasics and 12 controls. The aphasics had left hemisphere lesions. The controls get just the typical pattern of faster between in the right visual field, nothing in the left visual field. The aphasics gives you you get nothing in the right visual field, but you get categorical perception in the left visual field. Possibly, I would like to hope, I hope you will buy, that this is transfer of function following aphasia. I mean, that is something that is known to happen for lots of functions in lots of cases, that function over time gets transferred. When there's a lesion in one hemisphere, the function gets transferred to the other. Can't prove it. Okay, summary so far. I've got about 15 minutes, I think. Okay. Lateralized right visual field color CP is found in a variety of tasks on normal adults. Lateralized right visual field color CP has been found in colostomy patients. Lateralized right visual field color CP is absent in aphasics with left hemisphere lesions. However, these patients do show left visual field color CP. Lateralized right visual field color CP is found at lexical boundaries not present in English for speakers of languages containing those boundaries, namely Korean and Greek, and not for English speakers at those boundaries. Lateralized right visual field color CP has been found outside the color domain with the dog and cat silhouettes. Lateralized right visual field CP is, in normal adults, is consistently suppressed by verbal but not by nonverbal interference. Color CP has been found in the left visual field in some experiments. It is always weaker than in the right visual field, and the longer response times in these experiments suggest transcallosal transfer and/or scanning. The inference from the right visual field color CP to left hemisphere activity has been confirmed in an EEG study, the ERP study, and the inference from the right visual field CP to left hemisphere activity has been confirmed in an fMRI study. Well, maybe that's not quite right, but the involvement of the left hemisphere, that's wrong. But anyway, this is still true. So far, everything is consistent with left hemisphere language causing color CP in normal adults. So what about pre-verbal infants? So this was done with a fairly large number of infants, considering how hard it is to test infants. I don't remember the exact number. Also in Anna Franklin's laboratory in Surrey. And the technique used was the one of that I told you in the second Surrey experiment, where you had a background that was the distractor color, and then the target color just flashed in one place, and then the dependent variable was the time it took for the infant to make a visual saccade toward the target, before the time it took for them to start the visual saccade. And look at this. Everything is in the left, you have categorical perception in the left visual field, and nothing in the right visual field. Yeah, isn't that a shame? Let's assume that the left visual field CP in normals is illusory, reflecting transcallosal transfer and/or scanning, And let's also assume that the left visual field CP in aphasics with left hemisphere lesions reflects transfer of function. Then the apparent conflict between the right visual field CP in normal adults and the left visual field CP in infants can be explained as language acquisition taking over the categorization function from the left hemisphere, I should say from the right hemisphere into the left hemisphere as the child matures. It's amazing how many times you can read the same thing that you've written over and over and not see a mistake. So the take-home lesson is that normal adults under normal viewing conditions get two pictures of the world it should be, simultaneously, one filtered through linguistic categories and one not so filtered. So that's the qualified relativism that completes the first half of this two-part talk.
So we have time for a couple questions while Terry sets up his computer. So is there anybody? I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the infant result, because I mean, how difficult is it to isolate the scanning of these infants, given the preferential looking procedures that are used and the apparatus that you must need to?
Well, I mean, I've never been in that lab,
Yeah.
but the report, which is now published, does talk about that, and it talks about how many subjects were discarded, and they did throw away a lot of trials. There were a lot of trials that were thrown away because they couldn't get the infant to fixate or even cooperate. So, but I can't give you the details. Yes.
No, I'm just trying to see if that's the same person.
Well, can I unplug your computer?
Let me first do this, and now you can, yes. Yeah. Oh, you don't need to take it, but it probably, oh, I see. Okay. So this is yours.
Right.
And that's not going to help Terry because he doesn't have a Mac.
I have a question on that picture. Was that George Bush, the whole thing, or was that Alfred E. Newman? We can't tell. We can't figure it out.
Good.
So which category do we go into?
It's a somewhat different ambiguity.
So a bigger question: are there any other left hemisphere, right hemisphere color phenomena? I'm not familiar with any. I can't think of any. Do you get droop effects on one side, not the other side?
I don't know that anybody's ever investigated anything like that.
I know color science, but I've never seen anybody get any difference between the two hemispheres in any color graph at all. So this is amazing. Well, I wanted to see what people must have done, but then maybe not. But probably, I guess not. That's a terrific.
Okay. Any other questions? No? Okay, then I guess we'll move on to our next speaker. Part 2 is with Terry REGIER, arguing the...
How about a round?
Yeah.
First
Oh,
one.
yes. Arguing the qualified universalist position, I guess.
Great. Thanks, Kimberly, and thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. The work I'll be talking about is a continuation of the talk Paul gave and a continuation of the collaboration, or a description of the continuation of the collaboration with him, and also with Naveen Kater-Pal at the University of Chicago. In general, the debate over language and thought is framed by two fundamental questions. First, does language shape perception? Does the language that you speak shape the way that you see the world? And second, do languages vary largely arbitrarily in the semantic structures that they impose on the world? There are standard answers to these two questions that define the universalist and relativist stances in the debate over language and thought. A relativist answers yes to both questions. Yes, language does shape perception. And yes, languages do vary largely arbitrarily in the semantic structures they impose on the world. A universalist, in contrast, answers no to the same two questions. No, language does not shape perception. Instead, there's a universal repertoire of perception and of cognition that leaves its imprint on the languages of the world. And because of that imprint, no to the second question as well, languages are not free to vary arbitrarily. Instead, they're constrained to bear some trace of that imprint. Now, Paul has already given you a kind of neither nor answer to the first of these two questions. And I think the broader point of all of that, or the broader message that the demonstration suggests, is that the world is just a more interestingly complex place than would be suggested by this traditional framing of the debate. What I'd like to do is make exactly the same point again, but in a completely different way, with reference to the second of the two questions, whether languages vary arbitrarily. And to do this, I'll focus on color naming, which has, of course, been a topic at the center of the debate over language and thought for many years. And for decades now, there's been a more or less standard standard analysis or standard view of color naming, which holds that across languages, color categories like red and yellow and orange and so on in English are organized around 6 universal foci that correspond to what in English we would consider the best examples of black, white, red, green, yellow, and blue. These foci have been held to be universally privileged in both naming, in that they tend to get selected as the best examples of color categories across languages, and also in memory, and that it has seemed that color memory is better for these colors than for others. This view of color naming is very influential. It's often taught in introductory cognitive science, psychology, linguistics courses. It's certainly what I was taught when I was a student. And so it rather captured my attention when, several years ago, a number of people, Debbie Roberson, Jules Davidoff, and others, started arguing that everything I just said is wrong. Everything I just said about color naming is wrong. Everything I thought I knew about color naming and about color cognition was wrong. They argued for a full-throttled relativist view of exactly this field. They suggested there are no universal foci. Interestingly, they failed to replicate the earlier finding of privileged memory at those foci. And they suggested that if there are no universal foci, categories certainly are not organized around them. Instead, they suggested, categories are organized at their boundaries by linguistic convention. These boundaries are free to vary across languages, and memory varies with them. I'm going to argue today that both of these traditionally opposed positions are challenged by existing data. So I'll try to make that point first, and then I'll move on to suggest an alternative theoretical position, one that I think captures the best and hopefully discards the worst of these two standard positions. So first, a look at some of the data. This here is a standard color grid of the sort that's very commonly used in color naming and cognition research. And this here is the color naming system of Barinmo, studied by Davidoff, Roberson, and colleagues. Barinmo is a language of Papua New Guinea. Each colored blob here corresponds to indicates the extension of a named color category in this language. So there's a sort of a red, pink, orange term, a composite greenish blue term, and so on. Excuse me. This color naming system clearly is not at all like English. It certainly differs from the English system in that, for instance, we have separate terms for green and blue. They don't. And it has been held up as counter-exemplifying universal tendencies of color naming. When you look more broadly across languages, though, one thing that you find is a number of languages that look quite a bit like Barinmo. These are all taken from the World Color Survey, a study of 110 of color naming in 110 languages worldwide, looking at non-industrialized societies. I think significantly, many of these languages are spoken nowhere near Papua New Guinea, so it's rather unlikely that widespread borrowing somehow led to similar patterns in Papua New Guinea and, say, Honduras, Bolivia, Ecuador, so on. So this seems like very much a universalist point. At the same time, though, notice that even among this admittedly cherry-picked set of data, there are fairly interesting and sometimes reasonably substantial differences. And I think these two languages are a useful pair to look at just side by side. The yellowish, vaguely yellow term here is quite small, whereas it's much larger here. Now, and there are other differences across the other languages. Now, I think it's important to bear in mind that on a standard focus-based analysis or standard focus-based view, all of these languages would receive exactly the same analysis. They'd all be viewed as languages that have a focus in black, one in white, one in red, one in yellow, and then one in green or blue. So there's not really an accounting for the very real differences that exist. When you look more broadly across languages, those differences become even more apparent. And I should say that when I first took a look at these data, which I did in response to the sort of neo-Worfian challenge to the then reigning kind of universalist standard take on these questions, when I first took a look at those data, my immediate response was, oh my gosh, the relativists are right. Look at this variation. It's really rather striking when you look at the data, just how much variation there is. I know that that's not true. We've run objective tests to test for universal tendencies. They're quite real, but at the same time, the variation is quite real as well. And so the glass really is half full and it really is half empty. And so someone on either side of this can always find data to point to back their position. And so what we have on our hands is just empirically a kind of a mixed bag. And the challenge, it seems to me, is to theoretically make sense of that state of affairs. What I'd like to suggest, is a fairly simple proposal, which is that there is such a thing as a universal structure of color space, perceptual color space, and that universal structure makes some category systems more likely than others, but those others still have a fighting chance, if you will. Now that's kind of loosely, vaguely worded, so let's try to firm it up a bit. Specifically, what I'd like to suggest is that across languages, color naming may reflect near optimal partitions of perceptual color space. This is an idea that was proposed by Kimberly Jameson and Roy Andrade about a little over 10 years ago, although not formalized and fit to data, which is something I'd like to do today. It's, I think, an interesting proposal in part because it's similar to an idea that was proposed back in the 70s by Liljencrantz and Lundblom to account for systematicity in patterns of vowel categories across languages. So if a language has 3 vowels, they will be a, e, and u. If there's a 4th, that one is reasonably predictable as well. And the general notion I'd like to push here is that perhaps the same set of principles can account for systems of categories of linguistic sound in the case of vowels and systems of categories of linguistic meaning in the case of color terms, and possibly beyond, because we're currently looking into exporting some of these ideas to other semantic systems. The background for all of this is that perceptual color space, like vowel space, is irregularly shaped. That irregularity is not apparent at first when you look at the standard color grid. It seems that hue varies evenly along here, lightness varies evenly along there, but that masks the 3rd dimension of color, which is saturation. And saturation varies unevenly across this grid, such that, for example, the most saturated yellow is more saturated than the most saturated blue. And that can be seen if you take these points, which are effectively a sort of Mercator projection of a 3-dimensional space, and plot them in 3 dimensions. So this shows the same set of points now plotted in the 3-dimensional C-lab perceptual color space. C-lab is a space in which the distance between 2 colors is at least meant to approximate their perceptual dissimilarity. So the closer two colors are in this space, the more similar they are to a human perceiver. So what you have here is a kind of lumpy, knobbly globe, if you will. And the general proposal is that perhaps very simple clustering principles operating over that irregular surface will give us both the universal tendencies that we see empirically in the world's languages and the deviations from them that we also see in those languages. So that's the suggestion. To test this idea, we took a categorical partition of color space, any categorical partition of color space, to be well-formed to the extent that it maximizes perceptual contrast between categories. We took similarity between any 2 points to be just a Gaussian of distance in that color space that we're using, CLAB. We had an overall measure of within category similarity, which just sums similarity across those colors that are labeled the same way. An analogous measure of cross-category contrast, and then well-formedness is simply the sum of those two. Very, very simple. Our general prediction was that natural color naming systems, those that are attested in the world's languages, those should be near maximal in well-formedness. So if this is the space of all possible color naming systems, all logically possible ones, and that's the well-formedness, we expect Mother Nature to select from near the peak of that distribution. To test that idea, we created theoretically optimal color naming systems for 3 categories, 4 categories, 5 categories, and 6 categories. And I'll probably give you the sense for that right here. This is for a 3-category system. We initialize, this is the grid, right? This is the standard color grid. And white, red, and black stand for just 3 categories. We initialize the grid randomly, assigning categories randomly to each of the colors in that grid. And then performed steepest ascent in well-formedness so as to get the theoretically optimal configuration. We repeated this 20 times with different initializations and took the solution that gave overall highest well-formedness to be the theoretically optimal configuration for 3 categories. There are no foci in any of this, right? This is just that knobbly sphere and being divided up into 3 categories. Sure.
The function that you take similarity within a category and dissimilarity between. That's more or less arbitrary, and you could use a different. You use 1 minus similarity. You could use another decreasing function.
Yes.
Does this influence? I presume it doesn't influence the outcome.
I haven't explored the space of different ways of cashing out the same, cashing out this idea in detail. I know that there are a number of variations on the theme that give essentially the same qualitative answer. Yeah.
Could you just repeat again? I missed it. What stops the iteration? What stabilizes?
Oh, I'm sorry. We simply continue until we've reached a maximum.
Maximum well-formedness?
Yes, until no further. So you randomly select a chip and then flip it so as to maximize well-formedness. So pick the color for that. Pick the category for that chip that would maximize well-formedness, and you keep doing that until no matter which chip you select, there's nowhere higher to go.
And it always stabilizes.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Is the initial starting point change the stable point that you reach at the end?
Yes, it can.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
If you perform single pixels peak, or you allow for multiple?
Right. Single. So we're doing it one at a time. So right. Asynchronous updating rather than synchronous. Right. Which would make a difference.
So
Sure.
the distribution of those color points in this 3-dimensional space is
Mm-hmm.
not uniform.
It is not. No, it's not. That's right. It's not uniform. When you plot them in 2D, they do look uniform. In 3D, they're not actually uniform. They're close to it. They're something like the outer skin of that space.
You
Sure.
said that the initial conditions determine your final conclusion.
Correct, yes.
Are there any kind of rotational symmetries or anything else that are embedded inside the solution, from the initial conditions and how the final?
Not to my knowledge. Not to my knowledge. There may be, but not to my knowledge.
Because of the bump, I would expect it would be, but some relation.
Right. I'll get to rotation, actually, in just a little bit. Other questions? This is a good place for questions.
Still not understanding it. Every point in that three-dimensional space is a possible color.
Yes.
So what
Why
is giving a probability density in that space?
There are certain colors that are not. There are certain possible theoretically possible colors that aren't realizable, and so what we're looking at is sort of the outer skin of realizable ones. The outer skin of realizable ones. Let me illustrate the same basic principles giving us a six-term system. Again, without specifying foci, without specifying anything other than I'm looking for 6 rather than 3 categories. We again initialize, again iterate, same basic story. It's just steepest ascent. And that's what we get this time. Try it a different time. You might get a slightly different answer. But again, we're going to look at the best of the best that we get of multiple runs.
So in this case, you're saying that the similarity criterion that you described earlier is essentially forcing a connected set type of
Yes.
distribution of the.
Yes.
Of the,
Yes.
Is it your understanding that that's formally the primary impetus behind these connected set category contours?
It is certainly the case that
similarity alone, the way you formalized it
is enough to give you the connectedness of of the categories. Sure, absolutely.
Well, why did you use the achromatic colors?
At all?
You use the skin and then the axle that goes through it, or the axis.
That's true. It's not. You're right. It's not just the outer skin. The simple answer is we used those because we had them and we had data on them. And this was the set of points that we had data on. Now, I think it's an interesting question exactly which set of points, in some sense, should we be allowing in the simulation?
The total atlas of
Right. Right.
Optical Society of America.
Right. We haven't done that yet. So what we have so far is the points I've shown right now, and we're currently exploring exactly what happens under the kinds of variance that you're talking about, which is actually a critical question when you want to, as I do want to, export these ideas to a different semantic domain, because then you have to sort of think about exactly what corresponds to the outer skin of a different space. Sure, Paul.
Just to amplify your answer to Kim's question, another reason for doing these particular ones is that we had data that we're going to compare. We had data on these that we're going to compare, and that Terry is going to compare in a minute with these just theoretical simulations.
Sure, Kim.
One other quick question about the similarity index. So you had a distributional assumption in there. Is that right? I mean,
About where the points lie, you mean?
Yeah. Did you not? I mean, didn't you assume that they all have the same density function in terms of the?
We are simply taking the points that essentially what Paul just said is correct. We're taking the points that we have data on. In some sense, you're asking me a question effectively about exactly why is it that this works. Can I defer that until later when we see exactly how well it does and doesn't work, because it doesn't work perfectly. Okay, so let's if I may just put that for later. So this is how we obtain our theoretically optimal systems, and the obviously relevant question is how well do these stack up against reality, against empirical color naming systems? Sure.
With single pixel fitting, there's a risk to get stuck in a stable state and not find a real optimum.
To reach a local rather than a global maximum? Yes, you do. There is that danger. It's for that reason that we just run this multiple times. So this is how we obtain our theoretically optimal systems. The question is how well they stack up against reality. This is, after multiple iterations, after multiple initializations, this is our theoretically optimal three-term system. So the question is, are there languages that look like this? And the answer is that there are. These are three. There are a number of, I think, clear similarities in both the model and in real languages. We have a composite red-yellow term, a white term, and a composite black-green-blue term. All of this, of course, in sort of the traditional universalist lingo, but basically the extensions of these terms are reasonably similar. There are also some fairly detailed aspects of the data that are reasonably well captured. So, for example, the fact that the lightest shades of yellow are included in the white rather than the red-yellow category in both the model and in reality, that's well captured here. And that happens to be true here. It happens not to be true of systems with greater categories, again, either in the model or in reality. So that's a reassuring or positive point. The model is also wrong in some respects, and it is so systematically. And I'll point out the largest sort of deviation from empirical data. You'll see it's basically we have a problem in the blue region. Is sort of a quick way of putting it. You'll notice that this category boundary lies here, whereas in these languages the relevant boundary is sort of much closer to this end of the grid. And that's true not just for when we look at three categories, it's true more broadly. So there's something wrong in the blue region, and I'm not entirely sure what it is. Some people have suggested that it may just be CLAB. It may be the perceptual space that we're working in. People have suggested CLAB is off in the blue region. There's a different color space we're considering, and so on. This is our theoretically optimal solution for 4 categories, and here is one language that looks tolerably like it. Here's our theoretically optimal solution for 5 languages and for 5 categories, and a number of languages that look reasonably like it. There are actually a fair number more, and similarly for 6 categories. So there are languages that look, reasonably like the theoretical optima that we've produced. However, not all languages are so accommodating. Not all languages are so kind to us. There are a number that don't fit so well, with a comparable number of color terms, and here you have several of them. Nonetheless, what I'd like to suggest is that across languages, all color naming systems will be shaped to a detectable extent by well-formedness, as I've sketched it here. To test that idea, we took the Barinmo color naming system that I introduced earlier, and since it's been held up as counter-exemplifying universals of color naming, and we did something which I think is kind of fun, which is rotate it. This shows you that system rotated by 4 columns. So this category here is being to vanish off this end and reappear over there, since hue is a wraparound dimension. This shows you the same system rotated by 8 columns, and so on. We rotated this language by 2, 4, 6, 8, etc. columns all the way around the hue circle, giving us Barinmo as it actually is, and a number of variants of Barinmo as it could have been but isn't. And our prediction was that the natural boundaries should yield higher well-formedness than any of the artificially derived variants. Why? Because by hypothesis, those natural boundaries lie where they do because of an overall drive to maximize well-formedness, whereas in the rotated versions, the boundaries have been deliberately shifted away from their hypothetically near optimal positions. So this is why we expect higher well-formedness for the actually attested system than for a number of variants which are clearly comparable to it in complexity and the overall pattern of the categories relative to each other. That prediction was confirmed. This shows rotation on the x-axis and degree of well-formedness on the y. And the peak is, in fact, at the actually attested system, as suggested. And the point that this suggests, it seems to me, is sort of a universalist message, which is that it seems to be the case that Barinmo is located where it should be, if you will, in the hue dimension. Its actual location in hue is apparently the optimal location. In some sense, it fits the structure of perceptual color space. But at the same time, there's a rather different message in the same data here, in the same graph. Because that other point, this one right here, which is rotated away from the actual system, is nearly as good. Very nearly as good. And what that suggests, I think, at least suggests to me, is that there may be a number of fairly highly ranked systems, and then perhaps linguistic convention or some other non-universal force is free to select from among those highly ranked competitors. It isn't always. It's not always with all languages. Let me show you a couple other languages. You'll get a sense for what does and doesn't happen.
It's very interesting that that's order of magnitude the same as the difference of the technological ability to produce the color chips. That's almost the mean amount of error in producing the chips. If you look at the chips versus where they should be in the Munsell system.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Or for example, a better thing, you can pay $800 for a Japanese system, book of Munsell and $800 for an American. That's roughly the amount of error between the two. Order of magnitude.
I'm sorry, what corresponds to the rotation?
It's actually one hue off, but if on average.
So what's corresponding to the rotation when you're comparing the Japanese and the English book?
Well, you can compute where the aiming points were of the Munsell.
Okay.
And then you can ask, where did the chips get? Because there isn't any way to know that. Because it developed over the centuries from artists.
Right.
And Munsell patented it back in 1905, and then we've developed it since. But that's order of magnitude of modern printing technology.
Interesting.
They're off. Modern printing technology is off about one hue step. You've got two there.
Right. I see. Well, I'll actually a little later show you something a bit different from this, and be interested to hear your response at that point. Sure.
I'm just wondering how reliable, how much variability there is between individual color namers. You've got these boundaries drawn as though there's.
Right.
So what's the story there?
The story there is that it varies a fair amount from language to language. In some cases, the data that we have are fairly variable across speakers. In some cases, the consensus is very high. But to clarify what I'm showing you, and thanks for asking the question because I didn't make it quite clear, the stuff that looks so clean, that's what we call a mode map, which is to say we're giving you the modal response for each of those stimuli. The modal category assigned, the modal label assigned to each of those stimuli. Okay. Sure, Lisa. Right.
Did you rotate by the rows at all just to see if just because it's when you were showing before the blue discrepancy, it seemed like part of the problem was
I haven't done that, but I don't see any. I would expect the effect to be strong. Like for one thing, hue rotates and lightness doesn't. But one could imagine sort of compression, decompression, whatever, sort of various distortions along the lightness dimension. I wouldn't expect the results to be dramatically different, but it's certainly something one could examine. Excuse me one second. Okay, so I thought it might be fun to take a look at a different language. Piraha, which has gotten some attention recently. Dan Everett has made a number of fairly strong and interesting claims about this language, including the claim that it lacks recursion, lacks number terms, and, as it happens, that it lacks color terms in the usual sense of the expression. He suggests that color naming in Piraha is a matter of idiosyncratic coinages, sort of on-the-fly coinages, such that something might be described as having a sort of blood-like color, something else a kind of dirt-like color. So based on things that are around, that are familiar to the Piraha in their day-to-day environment, and done on a sort of basically on-the-fly fashion, but differently for different speakers. That's the suggestion. These are here, these are color naming data from Piraha, collected by Steve Sheldon in, I think, 1977, a long time ago. And it seemed to me a useful thing to do, given the claims that have been made, would be to do for Piraha what we did for Barinmo, since, in fact, both of these languages have been held up as counter-exemplifying universals of color naming. And so we did that, and the result is pretty similar, although without that little near peak, that little sub-maximum that we got in Barinmo. So the peak for Piraha is, the peak in well-formadness is for the actually attested system rather than for any of the artificially obtained rotated variants, suggesting that Piraha as well, that these data from Piraha as well fit the structure of perceptual color space. So these two counterexamples, or these two proposed counterexamples, don't seem to counter-exemplify as much as you might expect. Now, this shows you the results we get for the same rotation analysis now applied to all 110 languages of the World Color Survey with results averaged together. And what you get, of course, is a peak at the unrotated system. And the point that's suggested here is that what was true of Piraha and Barinmo seems to apply more generally across languages. These languages seem to fit the structure of perceptual color space in general. Now, when you view languages in aggregate, as I do here with an average, it's kind of unsurprising, perhaps, that what you get is a sort of universalist message. And so I thought it might be useful to take a peek under the hood, as it were, at some of the individual languages that make up this average. And when we do that, what you see is that, in fact, not every language peaks at the unrotated system. There's a tendency for that to happen, but not all of them. So, for example, this language here peaks at, what is it, 6 or 8 or something like that, off. I'm actually not sure what that language is. I can find out. But what I think is interesting is that I'm pretty sure it's not one of the ones that's been held up as a counter-exemplifying universals of color naming, but it does. So this is one that perhaps more attention should be paid to. Mm-hmm.
Have you color-coded those lines against latitude?
The lines here? So,
yeah,
you mean so?
If you coded those from near the equator to high latitude, would they cluster?
The sort of Lindsay and Brown kind of lens luminescence question. No, haven't done that. But of course, we know that GRU and so on is predicted by ultraviolet radiation from sunlight. Yeah, for reasons that I think are not the ones that were originally suggested. But I think a broader question is, why exactly do we see the particular kinds of variation that we see? Are there forces other than the universal structure of perceptual color space and linguistic convention at play, sort of environmental forces? I think that is an interesting question, which we haven't explored fully yet. Sure, Kimberly.
Can you say a little bit about, as the number of terms in a language increases, how the fit varies with regard to this non-rotation solution?
Mm-hmm,
So, I mean, presumably, there's going to be differences in achieving a fit, depending upon whether you're looking at a 3-language system versus a 10-language system.
Right. I haven't done it systematically, but I've done it unsystematically, and when I do it unsystematically, I don't see any huge difference.
No difference.
One would sort of intuitively expect it to get better and better with more and more terms.
That they would get, you mean that the peak would get sharper?
Right. The peak ought to be more precise.
Well, when you have more and more terms, you also have, unfortunately, it's confounded with more and more often confounded with more and more noise in the data. So this is something, all right, so this is something that's, yeah, I don't know. I think it's a good question, but I don't know the answer to it. To wrap up, my bottom line is pretty simple, that natural color naming schemes are near optimal in the sense that I've articulated, which seems to explain universal tendencies in color naming. But the differences in boundaries are very real, and such differences sometimes yield only very small differences in well-formedness, which may such that language may have a certain amount of wiggle room, if you will, if Mother Nature is indeed selecting from somewhere near the peak of that distribution. So returning to the broad universalist relativist framing that I started with, I'd like to suggest that what we have here is a well-specified middle ground between the two. Color naming does reflect the universal structure of perceptual color space, but it also seems to accommodate a certain amount of language-specific variation. And I think the point that's suggested by all of this is very much is sort of very consistent with the broader point suggested by what Paul was saying earlier, namely that the world is just a more interestingly differentiated and interestingly complicated place than a standard relativist or a standard universalist account would suggest. So I'll end with that. I'd like to thank Naveen Katar-Pal at U of C, who has been centrally involved in this, and NSF for support, and thank you for your attention.
You sort of referred to this analogy of vowel system.
Yes.
And so certainly in phonetics, it is the case that sounds that are not in your native language are hard to tell apart.
Mm-hmm.
And
categorical perception.
And you don't see that here, though, right? Or do you?
You do. You do. That's what that's what categorical perception of color is. So you have categorical perception both in speech and in sort of the referential world. When applied to speech, we ordinarily call it categorical perception. When applied to the referential world, we usually call it a Whorf effect. But I mean, there are other kinds of Whorf effects. I don't want to overdo this. But a common reason for saying I have an effect of language on thought or on perception, commonly what that's operationalized as is I've found language-driven categorical perception of some domain, for instance, color.
But then I didn't understand that gentleman's question. I thought you sort of suggested that you did not see any evidence that there was linguistically based color perception. But then it looks like he's saying there is clearly linguistically based color perception. It is algebraic perception.
I think that
Right.
seems to be the heart of the problem that hasn't actually been totally clarified.
But that's what
You can imagine maybe a hypothetical world where everybody, no matter what culture they're brought up in, still has the same color perception, but they just talk about them differently.
Yeah. You could imagine such a hypothetical world, but it wouldn't be ours. I mean, we have good evidence for language-driven categorical perception of color, very much by analogy with the sort of thing that you see in speech perception. I mean, so it does seem to be lateralized to the right visual field, but in the right visual field, it's very, very much there, and it does vary across languages in a very predictable way. In a way predictable by the semantic categories of that language. So, it's I think it's a reasonable analogy, the sort of speech color analogy.
I want to ask a question. Very nice talk, by the way.
Thank you.
I want to ask a question about the relationship between color space and the solutions that you're finding in your model and the relationship of those to your empirical workforce. So you're using the CIE lab space, which you could use any space that you wanted to, but this just happens to be one perceptually uniform space that you could use, and it's a fine choice for what you use it for. But we know that, for example, in this space, there'll be variation across the color space, like there'll be more green samples, and there'll be a structure imparted from that. And there'll be fewer yellow samples. In the OSA space, you'll get a different structure, and so on and so forth. Okay, So there's some inherent
Yes.
topology, there's some inherent structure in that, in using that model.
And in the sample of colors within that space that we looked at, yes.
Exactly.
Mhm.
So when you do your analysis, which is very nice, you show that using the space with your well-formedness measures, your similarly measures as you formulated them, optimizes that index, that well-formedness index that you have, and that the model of that well-formedness actually provides a structure of solutions that fits these languages that you see in the world color survey. So that's a very nice correspondence. What I want to ask is what you think is going on in that fitting of so many languages, because I want to know if you think that those languages that are only matching those unrotated models that you come up with, if they're entirely basing their naming on something that's similar to the structure inherent in this perceptual model, or if there's some other way to explain with other exogenous types of things that don't have to do with color, how there might be an interplay between that model and what's going on in the solutions that you come up with.
Okay, I am not 100% sure I understand exactly what you're asking, so so you're asking about other forces that might be shaping
the perceptual space.
Yeah.
This one or any other one that you use, you think would predetermine in some ways the kinds of solutions and the kinds of correspondence of the solutions that you're seeing in the languages.
Sure. I mean, absolutely. So, for instance, if it turned out that that CLab or whatever space you choose, had a bulge, a saturation bulge, just we have a saturation bulge at yellow and we don't at blue. If it was the other way around, we would get different results. Absolutely. We would get very different results. We'd probably get results that were rotated by about 180 degrees. But sure, I mean, this seems to be a reflection of what I was suggesting, very general clustering principles operating over a space, over a surface that is lumpy and not. It's not a sphere. that is sort of interestingly non-spherical.
So then, Kip's going to follow up with this, having to do with space.
Well, no, let me add a little bit of data.
Yeah.
When I was working with Jeff Iris, you can take the three basis functions that generate all possible Munsell spectra, and you can take them in increments and iterate out to the edge. And Jeff figured out a way of computing what the boundary of all possible reflected spectra lying between 400 and 700 nanometers and 0 and 1 that are generated by the basis functions. And clearly the yellow is a bump out there at one end, and it goes down to a bump on the other side that is darker, that is at blue. So that it's clearly not a symmetric space of physical possible colors generated just as a reflectance spectrum. And you can see that if you look in and there's just no question about the physical facts. From the yellow to blue, it just goes down like that, and this is up here in light, and that's yellow, and it's blue down here, and as you rotate that, it becomes symmetrical at the so-called red-green dimension. So that if they took the physical reflectance spectra and either generated artificially or in the Munsell atlas, they would get exactly the same results. I mean, just doing it physically, forget perception and everything else. What are the physical possibilities for surface color? Then that's what you get.
Well, see, I don't know actually. I mean, you said something different than what I thought you were going to say. I don't actually know if this is the kind of thing we want to do for a human observer type of experiment, because I mean, he's using the CIE lab because it's a model of the human perception of the physical reflectances, right?
it's a crude model. It's not
It is a
as
crude
accurate
model.
as
That's
That's
right.
right.
what I'm
And
talking
that's one
about,
point,
where
having-
Jeff derived it.
Right, and so that's one point having to do with the structure and the ordering that's inherent in the space and how that can vary across different systems and how that's going to imply different models, all right? If you can get the same exact result with pure reflectances, that even makes me scratch my head more because I wonder how does the human portion of this task come into play if you can get the exact same fit with reflectances. Now that's not Terry's solution. I'm not going to ask him to answer that because that's Kim's extrapolation of.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have an answer. I don't have an answer for it. I don't know.
The same question is it's the same question as with the CIE space. Basically, that you have structure inherent in the space, whether it's inhomogeneous.
Let me give you a thought experiment.
Okay.
Let's model the physical shape of color space, of surface reflectance. And let's take some blind people that were reared where they never talked about color. If you ask them to examine that tactically and talk about it, and to orient and to name different parts of that, they would pick out the yellow space. Because what I'm saying is that physically, the bumps on it are more noticeable than the non-bumps. And that those are the things that are picked out as your basic primary colors that are codified first.
Yeah, well, I understand that.
Well, I mean, let me not impose myself on it. I'm saying that there's physically out there a task to classify, and there are better and worse ways of classifying. And even people that don't have our sensory apparatus would eventually classify it roughly that way.
Because in Terry's model, it's just this very simple closeness versus in the space, similarity versus distance in the space. And if you're saying that the physical space is the same as the psychological space, well then it'll work either way.
Or to the extent that it has the same overall general structure with bumps in the same places and the knobblynesses in the same places and so on. Yes, I would expect it to work out. And I mean, in a way, one question. I mean, Kimberly, you're sort of saying, in some sense, you're wondering sort of what aspects of why is the structure as it is, and why are we getting the results we're getting? Let me highlight something that I've wondered about a bit, which is that I think it's sort of interesting that we're getting fits as C-Lab is considered to be roughly perceptually uniform, but for whom?
Exactly.
For whom? Not for speakers of Wobe, and not for speakers of Barinmo, and not for speakers of Peraha. To my knowledge, they've not been tested on speakers of those languages. So it does seem to be the case that even though we get categorical perception of color, even though we do get something which looks like a distortion of that space, there's enough that's at least close to universal in whatever the perceptual judgments that space was based on, so that you can generalize from them to speakers of radically different languages.
I agree. In the question of well-formedness across languages, you look from your graph towards the end, all the languages sort of peak at the best possible. They are well-formed.
They are nearly so.
When you have a normalized at the center, so they all have to.
I beg your pardon. Yes, these.
So are there languages that are just intrinsically poorly formed?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Relative to others, absolutely, absolutely, yeah.
And so if you talk to a person who speaks a language like that, what would your impression be as they talk about things in the world? Would they be making mistakes?
Well, I can tell you that the main thing I know about languages that are well-formed versus ill-formed, if you will, is that the ill-formed languages are the ones with fewer color terms. So, for instance, a language with 3 color terms, a kind of a red-yellow and a kind of a green-blue-black and a white, that's a not very well-formed system. It's as well-formed as you can get, given that you're restricted to 3, but it doesn't stack up against ones with more.
So I'm wondering, if you talk to them, would you get the impression that they were using a lot more words to describe their chromatic experiences? Alan Humphrey's question here. That like our I'm just if people speak Spanish. It used to be they take 10 times longer to say than people speaking English. I know that they're getting the same amount of information, but there's just a lot more syllables coming out.
Well,
And that's because I don't speak the language, of course.
they probably feel that way about you.
So I'm wondering if I talk to one of these guys who's only got 2 or 3 colored words, are all his colored sentences really long? Because he's got to say red like this and red like that. And, you know.
Well, I'll refer back to Paul's point. I mean, I think if you're in an environment in which talking about color is not a particularly informative thing to do because all apples are red and all grass is green, then this may not be a problem that you encounter. But if you're forced by some anthropologist to do so, then yeah, I would expect that you sort of fall back on your, your adjective repertoire.
So we get kind of annoyed with the anthropologist.
I would imagine, yes.
Okay, we have time for one quick question, and Greg will be setting up his
Okay,
computer.
sure.
So according to your function that you optimize for,
Mhm.
what does